So on the slide, once it does come up, you'll see Jalasi, you'll see welcome, you'll see a word, it's Sego. So Sego is the Mohawk word for welcome. I am a Mohawk woman, so I'm from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is in Southern Ontario, is where my community is. I'm from the Mohawk Nation, and I'm from the Wolf Clan. So I am not Mi'kmaq. But I get mistaken, and I've been adopted, I was told by our president from NAG, because he was very proud on what I was able to accomplish during that amazing week that we had. So as my bio said, I've been doing training like this for over a decade, and was really proud of what I was able to put together with a team of awesome individuals like Alex, that we were able to facilitate with over 3,000 volunteers. So every volunteer that volunteered for the North American Indigenous Games went through that training and got this knowledge and had a better understanding on how to support those Indigenous youth who were coming for that week of the Games. And I was just blown away on the, the information I got back, the welcoming environment I got back from, all those who learned this training. So I'm really, really excited to be able to share it with you today, to take you through it. It was originally 90 minutes in length. We have done our best to cut it down, but we love to talk. I could talk about this all day long. I'm so passionate about this and passionate about sharing what I know and my experiences and my stories to you. So we've cut it down as best as we can. It's about 70 minutes now, but it's jam-packed, so buckle up. You just had another jam-packed presentation, and Chris set us up very nicely. You'll see a lot of similarities of social injustices that have happened between the groups. So that was a great, prerequisite to what we are getting into. I will pass it over to Alex Cherry to give her introduction.
Thank you so much, Serene. So this is co-facilitated cultural awareness training. I am non-Indigenous. I am originally from Ontario. My family is from Quebec, and so I am Francophone. I am very grateful to be living here in Nova Scotia, and I had the pleasure of working with Serene at the North American Indigenous Games, where I was the manager of volunteer services. So if any of you here volunteered, were part of the games, thank you so much. This training, as Serene said, was part of our mandatory training for our over 3,000 volunteers, and we considered this one of our greatest legacies for the city, to have those thousands of people with increased cultural awareness during and after the Games.
Perfect. So having an Indigenous and non-Indigenous facilitator was done for a reason. I think throughout this presentation, you'll see there's amazing illustrations on how to hold space, how to be ally, how to be there for someone. There are slides that do get a little heavy, and I think this is a great way to illustrate what being an ally can look like throughout this presentation. And because there are so much awesome information throughout this presentation, if you can keep your questions to the end, we have a time at the very end for any questions that you may have. And as you see in the packet that you had, all of the resources that we show throughout this presentation have been included in that in the printout that you have, which is awesome. And lastly, I would love to thank Elizabeth for setting this up. I know it was not a lot of work, and I don't know where she is, but thank you. You did awesome. All right, that's the right one.
So we're going to begin today with a land acknowledgement. We'd like to acknowledge that this training is taking place on the unceded and traditional homeland of the Mi'kmaq people. We do land acknowledgements as part of the reconciliation process. In order for this building and these streets to exist, and for Canadians to enjoy the lives that they have, Indigenous people were removed, displaced, and killed. This truth is an uncomfortable one, but one that is necessary to face if we as fellow Canadians are to understand our whole history. This land acknowledgement will not give back the land to its original caretakers. It is symbolic in nature, and it is up to you and me to do the real and actioned work of reconciliation. We honor the Mi'kmaq, whose stories have been shaped by Mi'kma'ki. Also in recognition, we want to say that Nova Scotia is also a historic site for the Black community and building Canada. African Nova Scotians are distinct people whose histories, legacies, and contributions have enriched Mi'kma'ki, known as Nova Scotia, for over 400 years. So we have a few learning objectives for today. So even though we're only here for hopefully just 70 minutes, this is an introduction to cultural awareness. Oh, there's the clicker. Sorry, everybody. And this introduction to cultural awareness, we look at the relationship between Indigenous peoples and Canada, but in recognition of the land that we're in, there's a focus on the Mi'kmaq people. We look at it understanding, acknowledging privilege, much like Chris spoke to earlier, and bias. And lastly, understanding what an ally is and how to be an ally for Indigenous people. So today's session might be uncomfortable at times for some of you, and it will look and feel different for everybody. So please know that we hope this is a safe space for learning and collaborating, and we hope that you approach all of today's information with a good heart and an open mind. This material will have some difficult content, and it may be emotionally triggering to some, so we encourage that if it is emotionally triggering, that you seek some support afterwards and have other local resources to process that. So again, much like Chris, we are a perfect follow-up to you. Thank you for setting us up so well. We'll start with terminology and really understanding how the overarching terms and also how terms have changed over time of how to talk to and describe Indigenous people. We'll also be referring in this presentation to Turtle Island, which is the Indigenous term for North America. And so to start, I'll be sharing a 3-minute video, which is a great resource with the history of terminology that'll give you a better understanding of decolonizing language as well. And it is from Inuk journalist Ozzie Michelin, and it's called How to Talk About Indigenous People, and it's a 2017 CBC video. Here we go.
I'm Ozzie Michelin, and I'm an Inuk journalist from Northwest River, Labrador, and I'm here to teach you how to talk about Indigenous people in Canada. Let's start with the term Indigenous. According to the United Nations, there are 370 million Indigenous people worldwide, spread across 70 countries. In Canada, there are approximately 1.4 million people who identify as Indigenous. Here, there are 3 distinct groups that make up the term Indigenous: First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. First Nations is the largest and most varied group of Indigenous people, and they can be found from coast to coast to coast. Sometimes I hear people using the term Indigenous and First Nations as if they were interchangeable, but they're not. Using Indigenous when you're referring to a specific group is kind of like saying Asian when you're referring to the Vietnamese or South Koreans. It works sometimes, but if you use it all the time, it just sounds wrong. The rule of thumb is to be as specific as possible. If somebody's Cree, it's okay to refer to them as being Cree. And if you don't know, ask them how they self-identify. Next are the Métis. The Métis are the descendants of First Nations and European settlers, and often refer to a distinct geographic group coming from the historic Northwest. You can find Métis all across Canada, but they all share a unique, distinct cultural heritage. The Inuit are the maritime circumpolar people of Canada, with a homeland stretching all the way from Siberia to Greenland. In Canada, there are 4 Inuit homelands, but they're not all just north of 60, with populations in both Quebec and Labrador. In the Inuit language, Inuktitut, the word Inuit means people. And you might have heard the term Inuk before. Inuk means person. So remember, it's one Inuk, many Inuit. And don't say Inuit people, because that's redundant. So that's it for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. But what about Aboriginal? Do we still even use that term? Well, generally, no. It's out there still, but it's being replaced by Indigenous, which is an internationally used term. So remember these simple rules if you want to get it right. Be as specific as possible. If you're referring to one person or one community, then name it. If there's more than one community or people, then use the broader terms like First Nations, Inuit, or Métis. If there are different groups together, then say Indigenous. And if you don't know, ask. Most people are happy to tell you about where they're from, and where their parents are from, and where their grandparents are from, and where their whole family is from. That's kind of how it works in the Indigenous world. Thanks, I hope that helps. Nakumek.
Okay, good. Not starting again. Thank you for reminding us the importance of closed captioning. So as Ozzy is a very great presenter, but to remind when it comes to terminology, be specific with the knowledge that you have. So know if I'm just referring to Serene, I can be like, Serene is Mohawk. But if referring to groups of people who have different backgrounds, if I refer to Serene and my friend Zane, who is Mi'kmaq, then I might say that they're First Nations or Indigenous. So really recognizing that it has to be specific, but also broader terms for when there's people from different nations. Also for asking somebody, as they said, if somebody says they're Indigenous, they'll probably be very proud to share what their background and community associations are. One thing to add is that when it comes to terms, a word you might have heard before that's used in the United States but not in Canada is the word tribe, and our Canadian equivalent is the word nation.
Thank you. So that just ask. There was a moment where it was not good to be us. It was illegal to be us. And we were ashamed to share who we were, but that's not the case now, especially our younger generation. Oh my gosh. You ask them and they will tell you who their grandparents are, where their community is, all about them. So definitely ask. And I always bring this up, like if you are, learning about something new, what do you usually do when you want to learn about something new, whether it's astrology or that new slang that's on TikTok? Like you do a little bit of research, right? And you ask around. So don't be afraid to do that with other areas in life as well. So what to use, the W or the Q when talking about the Mi'kmaq? This came up quite a bit when we were working with the North American Indigenous Games and thought it was really important to share. And you've probably noticed the different ways if you have ever seen the word Mi'kmaq. So Mi'kmaq is a verb-based language. So for example, when we use jalase, which is an active verb, it means instead of just the word welcome, so instead of just welcome, it means way more than that. It means we're welcoming you in and having a seat at our table. So our language is way more than just that word that's been translated into English, just something to think about. So when we're looking at Mi'kmaq with a W or Mi'kmaq with a Q, the W is used when it's a singular noun. So W should be used when referring to an individual. The Q is used a plural non-possessive noun and should be used when referring to a group. So that's the most simplistic way of remembering the Q or the W, and I'm pretty sure that's part of the resource in the little booklet you got, so you have a nice illustration, so if that ever comes up. Okay, so this first half of our presentation, we're going to be looking at the history, learning a bit of the history. You might have heard the word reconciliation. I believe in order to have reconciliation, you have to have a baseline understanding and awareness of a group or of that person. So for in this instance of us Indigenous people. So this first half of this presentation is going to look at the history between Indigenous people and European explorers that came to Turtle Island throughout, so starting at pre-contact, going into contact, and then we'll move up into today, and how we can move forward in a better way, in a good way together today. Pre-contact means before European contact. So Indigenous people have been on this land since time immemorial. Time immemorial, you've probably heard that term before. So that means before records, before time started, basically, before we started putting the 1990 or 2000s. Oral stories are an integral part of who we are as Indigenous people. And within every Indigenous nation, oral stories are how we learned, how our youth figured out what their place was in life, how they learned, what their ancestors did up until now. Each nation passes down oral stories through generations. There are stories that explain the past, again, teaches generations their new roles while on this land. There are stories that have been passed down through our generations that share how specific land was formed. This is our proof of how long our ancestors have been here. There are stories from the Mi'kmaq Nation on how the 5 islands were formed in Mi'kma'ki. Even if you go out west to the coastal islands or the coastal region, there are stories on how this huge mountain called the Black Tusk Mountain in Vancouver, or in BC, how that mountain was formed. Their ancestors have passed down these stories through generations and generations, and that's our proof on how long our ancestors have been here. This image here, you can click on it, or I'm not sure if you're able to click on it, but it'll open up a map of historical moments in Indigenous history, key historical moments in Indigenous history. Again, this link is included in that package. No, it's not this one. Yeah. So this is jam-packed full of information. It goes up until 2016. Of course, a lot has happened since then, but definitely includes a lot of key moments in Indigenous history. So something to take a look at. So we can go to the next slide. So pre-contact, we're still on pre-contact. The earliest identified evidence of people in Mi'kma'ki comes from the Debert archaeological site, which has found artifacts which date between 13,300 and 11,100 years ago. Those are images of some of the artifacts that have been found in that archaeological site. Debert is the oldest directly dated archaeological site in Canada and is among the largest and best preserved archaeological site of this age in North America. Debert's not too far from here. You can go check this space out. I've been there. It is unreal. This, again, if you can click this image, it'll open up to a website. It goes to the, so this website here is jam-packed full of information on the Mi'kmaq. It also shows all of the artifacts that they found. They took photos, is carbon dated. That's how it's a scientific proof of how long those artifacts have been here. So I like to show both sides of it. Our oral history is our proof, and then there's scientific proof, because some people need that. This website also holds a ton of videos of elders sharing stories. So if you're interested in hearing that story of the 5 islands being formed, you can go to this website and check it out. Highly recommend taking a look in this website. It's just packed with so much information, so you can continue your learning beyond this. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Oh, usually I have my computer up here and I'm just like, okay, so we're still at pre-contact. Indigenous nations developed sophisticated and intricate ways of living and thriving in their environments and on their lands before contact. I feel like there's a misconception that our ancestors needed help at one point, that we weren't doing well, that we were all fighting against each other, but that's not the case. We all had our own ways of being and they were thriving. Turtle Island, or what we call North America now, has distinct geographical differences which have an influence on cultural customs, practices of all nations. So one of the big takeaways is that there are more than just the Mi'kmaq Nation. There are more than just the Mohawk Nation. There are over 700 different Indigenous nations right now. Of course, there were more beyond that at one point, but right now we've counted over 700. And we all have our own customs, our own traditions, our own ways of being, based on where we are placed within Turtle Island. One of the other components too that I like to mention is that our ancestors never had the concept that land could be bought, sold, traded. That was never a mindset that they had, or ideology that they had.
And so this is, and also on top of the mindset of land not being bought or sold, the idea of borders were very different. Our current colonial understanding of our geography is, extremely different than the one that we can see on this website called nativeland.ca. It's a global website, so currently we were looking at Turtle Island, and it can give you the idea of how the territory that these different nations were in. And so Mi'kma'ki was not just Nova Scotia. Mi'kma'ki was also New Brunswick, eastern parts of Quebec, northern Maine, PEI, and also parts of Newfoundland. I also invite you, if you're ever going to go in a region that has Indigenous populations, to look up what were the first peoples in that area. And it will show you the different groups that, nations that lived in those areas before the arrival of others, which we'll talk about. And so the diversity and the overlapping also, it doesn't have the same distinctive borders. So again, the ideas of borders are arbitrary and very colonial concept. So to keep that in mind of our understanding of land and not the idea of ownership.
Go back to the slide. Perfect. So as I'd mentioned, each nation had our own ceremonies, our own protocols, our own beliefs, but we all shared a similar worldview concept, and we still share this similar worldview concept. So that connection to Mother Earth, that connection to Earth. Any of our creation stories, we've learned from the Earth and those beings that were on the Earth before we came here. Our laws are based on how the animals lived. A lot of our ceremony are based on what was already here. So we have this really strong core connection to Mother Earth, and it guides a lot of what we do. Our traditional languages, I had mentioned, they illustrate that connection to each other and to land. So you could imagine not having that language and it being taken away, how it's changing your view of the world. Another core concept that pretty much every nation has is thinking of those next 7 generations. So when you think about 7 generations ahead of you, you probably won't see that 7th generation. It's very far away. But we think about every step we take, everything we say, every movement we make on Mother Earth is affecting those 7 generations. So we want to move in a good way. So that's another core concept that we share. And again, I just love to reiterate that it was never a concept of buying or selling or trading land when we viewed it the way that we did. So Indigenous ways of being, again, these existed before European contact. Our Indigenous ancestors were thriving in every single one of those areas that you see on that screen. Usually I go into depth in every bubble and I love it, but I'm gonna save you guys some time today. I pulled 5 out to share examples. Again, that resource list, I have examples of all of those areas, Mi'kmaq focused, and they can share some examples of that. So language, every language is unique. There's different dialects. There's an estimate that over 500 languages were spoken before contact. I think there was more than that. And when thinking about Mi'kma'ki, there are at least 3 different dialects just here in Mi'kma'ki. Not even thinking about my Mohawk Nation, we have different dialects too, and it depends where we are located. So Cape Breton has a different dialect than New Brunswick. They have a different dialect than Quebec. So something to keep in mind if you're ever looking to incorporate Mi'kmaq language into your area, be mindful of the dialects. Storytelling or recording stories. So these were used for ways of connecting individuals to their past, their legends, their identity, and cultural duties. Stories are the foundation of each nation. Recording these stories and agreements was done through wampum belts, petroglyphs, totem poles, hieroglyphs. There's all different ways to actually record them, as well as the oral story passing down. Music, singing, dancing, these were used for healing, ceremony, community, recording events. I really utilize this when going into art therapy because a lot of our ceremonies incorporates art. It's integral in most of what we do. Our regalia making, we make paddles to stir ashes for a ceremony, and the making of a paddle is an artistic form. So that's really integral to being balanced and human. It's art, it's expression. Social organization, so every nation belongs to an organized society like families or larger groups like clan systems. When I introduced myself, I introduced that I am from the Wolf Clan. So even if people are not, or community members are not blood related, we are related if we're part of the Wolf Clan, and we have our own duties when we go to ceremony. We're a family, we take care of each other. It's custom within our communities to not marry a Wolf Clan, because if, say there's a passing in the family, We have different sides in our longhouse, and if you're married to a wolf clan, you're not able to take care of that person. So that's one of the reasons behind that. We all take care of each other when needed, and celebrate, and all the good stuff too. Shelter. Within the social organizations, I come from a matrilineal society, and a lot of nations have that, matrilineal society. So we have clan mothers who make the decisions for the community and on behalf of community, with community, and the chiefs are the one who carry out those decisions. That's our traditional way of being. Within my community right now, we still have that traditional society, but we also have what we call band council, which was introduced when the Indian Act was produced. That's part of the government. And that's so different, right? It's mainly ran by men, which is changing now, but that's how it was originally created. And decisions weren't made on behalf of community or with community, they were just made. It was all about money, and it still is. And you can imagine having both of those entities trying to lead a community and they don't get along. And that was done for a reason. It wasn't until a few years ago where those two have actually agreed on things and moved forward together, and there was movement, opposed to clash and divide within community. Shelter, so these are designed related to environment, movement patterns. The Mi'kmaq lived in wigwams. They did not live in teepees, they lived in wigwams. Districts of Mi'kmaqi, those borders that were on there, they changed because of different patterns of water, drainage, growing of food, animals for hunting, so that all changed and they moved with the seasons. Where from my community, we lived in longhouses, huge structures where everyone lived inside. We didn't move. We even built fences around, we farmed inside of them, our warriors protected our space, we stayed in one area. And then you think about the Plains nations, they lived in teepees. Again, because they had different movement patterns based on seasons and all different things. So we are all unique in our own ways. Again, highly suggest you take a look at the resources that I shared. It goes into depth in all those areas, and it's just so awesome and unique, and love sharing that information.
All right, so after Serene's beautiful talk about Indigenous ways of being, and now we're getting into contact. So contact means the appearance and the sustained presence of Europeans on Turtle Island. Now, the date of the first European contact with Indigenous peoples varies greatly by region. The first recorded arrival of Europeans in Mi'kmaqi was in the 1400s. And then over time, and it took a long time, but then there was arrival and then settlements and contact moved west. So because of that, the impacts were felt differently in different regions. And it's felt the most deeply in the East because it has been happening the longest. So the changes and the beautiful Indigenous ways of life, which Serene just described, and which I'm sure she could do a full presentation just on that. The impacts of contact were felt in language, way of life, ceremony, social structures, and home territory displacement, and even the types of homes that people were able to have. And that started and continued and was sustained. While they were felt similarly in each nation, and there was a loss of song, loss of dance, tradition and culture, that colonization and that change to Indigenous ways of being runs so much deeper in the East. And because of that long period of initial contact and sustained colonization. So, but why were they allowed to change? You might be wondering, like, they arrived, why were they allowed to change, or how is that brought into being? So it seems something that is irrefutable now because the change has already happened. But there was something that was created that gave all of these, what they call themselves explorers, the moral and political authority to make these changes and to take things away. It's something called the doctrine of discovery. This is sometimes new information, perhaps you've already all heard about it or not. It was really a framework and a document that was created to allow the extraction of resources and the taking of land and imposition of European ideals, values, and religion on the land. So when is it from? It's from a very long time ago, but its effects are still felt today. It was written by the Pope Alexander VI in 1493. And we might have heard and wonder why in 1493? Because in 1492, the Spanish explorer Columbus came, realized there was people already there, and then had to have reason to take over that land. They had to have political will and political support to be able to do what they did. So it was written out. It was not something that was happening just as if it was something that could be ignored. So this document, the Doctrine of Discovery, it supported Spain's strategy in to take over the rights and have the rights to the land that was discovered. And why was it written by the Pope? So again, a little bit of a history lesson. At that time in Europe, the Pope had stronger political power than all the monarchies combined in Europe. So the word of the Pope would go above that of all the monarchies, and he would determine the direction politically of all of these regions. It was a driving force that justified the behaviors that started colonization and gave huge influence on the attitudes of people who remained in Europe, and that also a continued attitude and understanding and thoughts towards Indigenous peoples. This theory that was presented in this document was that Indigenous peoples, because they were non-Christians, were not human. And therefore, the land they occupied was empty. So I'm going to read a quote from the Doctrine of Discovery, and it's quite hard to take in, and it's not easy to read either. And this is just one sentence of a very long document that has this sentiment going through it. Invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue pagans and other enemies of Christ, and the kingdoms, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. This may be hard to listen to, it may be hard to read, and I'm going to let you all know that it is still cited in Canadian law. It's also what is what was the foundation for the beliefs about different peoples, and also was a foundation for taking over not just the ownership of land, but the extraction of resources from those lands. And so really gave everyone the right to the settlers, the explorers, to come and to take what they believed was theirs from groups who they believed were not people. Last year, I'll add the one thing, the Vatican repudiated this 550-year-old document, but that did not mean that they rescinded it. So it still exists, but they're just saying, oh, it was really bad. And so while Indigenous leaders welcome this first step, there's demands for the Vatican to formally rescind this document, even though it remains cited in Canadian law. Oh, right. I can print those out.
So that document started the mindset that anyone that wasn't Christian is not human, which still exists today. That mindset still exists today. The next document or piece of history that I want to share, I want everyone to know about, are wampum belts. This one in particular is a 2-row wampum. So wampum belts were made out of shells. Those little I don't know if you can tell, those are beads, and they were made from shells. You've probably seen those little clam shells on the shore. They're here. They have a little bit of purple in them. So that's where those purple lines came from. Don't ask me how my ancestors figured this out, because I've tried to make beads from those shells and they're so fragile. You need those big thick ones, right? But how did they do that? I don't know. So these belts were used to mark agreements between people. So my Mohawk Nation, we have agreements with the Mi'kmaq using these belts. But this one here you see in particular has significance in regards to treaties and covenants. So this came before treaties. This came before any idea of treaties. So the Truro Wampum Belt is a metaphor for how the European newcomers and the Haudenosaunee were meant to mutually agreed to live in peace as brothers while pursuing parallel but separate paths of culture, belief, law. So those two purple lines that you see, one represents the Europeans and their ships. The other represents the Haudenosaunee or Indigenous in their canoes, and they're traveling their own separate paths mutually, and side by side. They were never supposed to cross. They were never supposed to bump each other. They were never supposed to get in each other's vessels. Of course, that didn't happen, right? Those three white lines that you see are to represent friendship, good minds, and peace. Three words that if you know any other treaties that have came after this, those words are in those treaties as well. So it was our ancestors' mindset to mutually live together. We tried to establish that mindset a long time ago. So one other document we're going to share is a Royal Proclamation. This is a really important document to know, along with the Doctrine of Discovery. The Royal Proclamation is a document that set out guidelines for European settlement of Indigenous territories in what now is North America, or Turtle Island. So it was initially issued by King George III in 1763, and it was issued to officially claim British territory in North America after Britain won the 7 Years' War. So a lot of our Indigenous ancestors fought with Britain in the wars, especially this one, the 7 Years' Wars. So that's why there were alliances, and that's how these documents came to be. It explicitly states that Indigenous title has existed and continues to exist, and that all land would be considered Indigenous land until ceded by treaty. So this was the beginning of treaties. The proclamation forbids settlers from claiming land from the Indigenous occupants unless it has been first bought by the Crown and then sold to settlers. So that's a key point to take in. All of our agreements are not with Canada because Canada didn't exist yet. It's with Britain. So this served as a basis of the treaty-making process throughout Canada, and many believe an important first step towards the recognition of existing Indigenous rights and title, including the right to self-determination. So shortly after this, the Peace and Friendship Treaty was established, which I feel like you should all know about. It's celebrated here on October 1st here in Nova Scotia, and that was signed ending a lengthy period of warfare between the British Crown and the Mi'kmaq people. And then Canada becomes a country in 1867. All of this happened before Canada became a country. I always like to share this fun fact. Canada, the word Canada comes from a Haudenosaunee term or word, Canada, which means the village. A lot of province names, city names, street names that you see come from Indigenous languages.
So with the arrival of Canada, which is a Haudenosaunee word, and there is more history of before from contact until 1867 of Canada becoming a country. There's a longer history there of colonization, the Doctrine of Discovery, than there is from 1867 until now. So we're just talking about the recent history and the codification of continued colonization. So it was codified because it was put into law and it was made very formally. So the Indian Act came into place just less than 10 years after Canada was a country. And this included things that are still in place today. So the Indian Act still exists today. It includes status cards, the creation of reservations, creation of Indian agents that would control reservations, and it controlled and continues to control many aspects of Indigenous life and how it was written, who is considered Indigenous, and how it is written into law. And to be considered Indigenous in the eye of the law, you must abide by all of these rules and regulations. So there is residential schools, which I'm sure you have all heard of, which it would be inappropriate to call them schools. And the creation of these institutions was with our first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald. He used the term to take the Indian out of the child and to, quote, solve the Indian problem. So all of these acts of continued colonization were to subjugate and make this group of people smaller and less powerful. And so these residential schools, it continued on until very recently. The last one in Nova Scotia closed in 1966. The last one in Canada closed in 1996. There was also a continuation of the idea of residential schools, but where children were allowed to go home to their parents at the end of the day, called Indian Day Schools, and that last one closed in the year 2000. At NAG, many of our staff members either themselves attended Indian Day School, had family members who attended residential school, and the effects of those systems that are put in place are still felt very vividly by communities today. There's also the loss of status is something that was put in place by so many different things. The first is that if any woman married a man who was non-Indigenous, she would lose her status and connection to community. There was something later on called Bill C-31 that allowed that enfranchisement to be allowed to consider status. But there's also things, if you wish to own land, you had to give up status. If you wanted to vote, you would lose status. If you wanted to be in the army, you would lose status. If you wished to go to university, you would have to lose status. Anything that could bring more richness and power to you as an individual meant you had to leave your community and lose that status and connection. There's also banning of traditional customs. A gathering of 3 or more Indigenous people was considered illegal, and you would all be arrested. The same with if there was songs, dance, any traditional customs. Indian agents would take any regalia or objects that would be considered, for these traditional customs and would take them and then put them in museums. Many of these are still in museums. Large Canadian museums, such as the Canadian Museum of History, is doing a lot of repatriation and working with communities, but still, the taking of those items was continued for a very long time, and that leads to the loss of knowledge, as we said before, the loss of connection, the loss of awareness of traditional ways of being. And also, a hugest loss we can say is also the children, when they went to residential school, would be broken away from their families and have that loss of knowledge. There's a loss of parenting skills, but that loss was even continued by the government in a different way with something that you might have heard of called the 60s scoop, was the taking of children away from their families, and that is connected to the selling of Indigenous children. Children would be taken away from their families and sold to parents who are looking to adopt in the United States, across Canada, and other places in the world. So they were not only breaking apart families, but the government was financially benefiting from that distress. So there's so many things. Also, the last thing I'll bring up is the white paper and the red paper. The white paper was written by then Prime Minister Trudeau Sr., and also our later Prime Minister, Jean Chrétien, and it was about breaking apart the Indian Act and ending what they called the special relationship between Indigenous people and the government. It did not go through. There was in 1970, there was a response written by Harold Cardinal, who is a Cree lawyer and activist, and he wanted to bring hope, and he recognized that there was not the breaking down of it, but the reworking of what the Indian Act is that would ensure a positive relationship between Canada and its Indigenous peoples. So there's a lot more we could go into when it comes to continued colonization, but it's very important for me to take on this slide to talk about these things. And it's a very small way that I can support Serene and that I supported other of my NAG colleagues when we were working at the North American Indigenous Games, to take on that and to share the weight of that history.
you. It's always heavy reading that slide. My grandparents are residential school survivors. I attended Indian Day School. As an Indigenous woman, I was not meant to be here today, especially talking about what I'm talking about today. So thank you for bringing me in here. Thank you for listening. And every time I say that, it lights that fire in here. I wouldn't be who I am today without my grandparents, especially my grandmother, who went to residential school the longest. No granddaughter should hear the stories that she shared with me while attending that school, prison. But she shared them with me to share with you and to continue, sharing what I can with others to help build a better understanding of who we are and what we've gone through and the similarities or differences that we have, and how we can move forward better together. I always like to thank Alex for taking that on because it is a heavy slide, but that is one way of showing support and showing allyship. Most Indigenous people that you'll have met will have been affected by one of those on that page, and that's not everything. Most, if not all, are affected by that. So that's something to keep in mind when going about your everyday. But this is also why having cultural awareness training like this is so important, why helping create space for others is so important. It makes a huge impact, and it's long life-landing. Our kids, as Chris had mentioned, our kids are learning how to be and be with each other differently, which is so beautiful and why we do this heavy work. I also like to invite people to shake it out. It was a heavy slide. Be goofy, shake it out. It might be sitting in your body somewhere. You can tap it out too if it's sitting in your neck somewhere. Don't take that heaviness home with you. Leave it here. Some of those items on the list may be new to you. You might just be learning these today. Don't feel sorry about that, because that was done on purpose. You were not meant to know what has happened. So thank you again for sitting here, for listening. Now we have to do the work to figure out how we move forward after knowing this, right? How are you going to move forward in a different light knowing this information? You have the power now. This next video that I'm going to show is a little snippet of a video that Treaty Education Nova Scotia put together. And I really love it because it illustrates what the province is doing within the educational system to move forward a bit better or in a different light. So I have a little snippet that I'll play. Hopefully you can help me out. Treaty Put the captions on, please.
Treaty education is teaching all Canadians on who the Mi'kmaq are, where we've come from, and how we can kind of all move forward together.
Never again will Indigenous history not feel integral to Canadian history. Reconciliation is not an Aboriginal issue, it's a Canadian issue.
We had to get all the stakeholders in the room, the educators, the elders, the youth, the leadership, the people working for government. We said, can we develop a plan for treaty education moving forward? And it was from that we were able to put a comprehensive treaty education strategy in place. Then we were able to advocate and turn that into an MOU between the Mi'kmaq and the province that was signed in 2015.
I've been overwhelmed by the process that has taken place, and I want to say to you very proudly that we are all treaty people.
Nova Scotia has formed a unique provincial and Mi'kmaq partnership to further these and other goals, and together we're going to promote treaty education in every school, in every provincial government department, and with members of every community across Nova Scotia, not just the Mi'kmaq ones. Treaty education will cover 4 topics.
Who are the Mi'kmaq?
Why are treaties important?
What happened to the treaty relationship?
How can we reconcile our shared history?
teaching people it's not Indigenous history, it's Canada's history.
And that's a benefit for all people, no matter what their background is.
Treaty education is not just for in the schools, it's for businesses, it's for government, it's for the public sector, it's for everyone.
Our culture is so rich, and there's a lot to be shared.
Our worldview, our Indigenous knowledge, our contributions to Canada.
The knowledge that's been here for thousands and thousands of years has been held by the Mi'kmaq in trust for everyone.
If you want treaty education to succeed, your message cannot be about bitterness, anger, or resentment. Your message has to be about hope and moving forward together.
What needs to happen is we need to be that dream catcher generation. The dream catcher catches the bad dreams and lets the good ones flow through. And a lot of those feelings get passed down through different generations. I want that to stop with me so it doesn't pass on to the next generations.
Reconciliation itself refers to repairing the relationship that is broken. There's a huge strain on the relationship that we have. Both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people need to work together to rebuild that relationship.
We need to build allies. We need to build relationships. We need to focus on the positiveness.
That's one of the things about sharing, and one of the 7 sacred teachings that Aboriginal people have. It's about sharing and showing respect, and that's what we need to be able to do.
I have a responsibility for the next 7 generations to come. There's a future that we need to change.
What we could do is work with the future for the betterment of all of our children.
Tell our story and move forward for a better way of life for everybody.
Treaties are our way of life.
Your ancestors and my ancestors signed those treaties.
We're all treaty people.
And we're all in this together.
All right, I think that's a great video to move forward and go into the next half of our end of this presentation.
Treaty education is teaching.
All right. So while working on these huge games that we put on, I had the pleasure of meeting with community leaders and elders while developing this training, and I asked them what they thought was important to share to you. So this is what they had put together. We are still here. We are resilient. Our youth will lead us to building and repairing relationships, but we have to guide them in that direction. We have elders in universities sharing their knowledge. We have lawyers, doctors, teachers, business owners. Our communities are thriving and alive. Our ceremony songs, dances, and way of life are here and still carrying on with our little ones. We are building relationships with organizations like CBC who are creating spaces for our communities to share and tell our own stories and build awareness. So when thinking about moving forward together, I always like to challenge people. Reconciliation is learning that, baseline understanding, learning that education, that history. Well, let's move into reconciliation action and think about those actionable items that you can now do, knowing the information you know. And I challenge you to start thinking about the next 7 generations. So not just your own, but all of our next 7 generations. They're all being directly impacted by what we do, what we say, how we move and react with each other. So I challenge you to think about that.
Okay, sorry. So for this next phase of the presentation, we'll be talking about bias and privilege, which is something, again, Chris, thank you for giving us the foundation for what we're talking about from a slightly different perspective. So we have bias, which is a prejudice or an opinion against someone or a group, but discrimination is acting on that, right? And so most of us really want to discriminate on purpose, and unconscious bias is something that we all have. It's not something to feel bad about. It's informed by our past experiences, and every single person here, we have unconscious biases, either if we want to or not. And it's okay, but we have to be aware about what they might be and confront them. And privileged is the perceived right and unearned advantages, of which I have many, that are assumed to be available only to certain people or groups of people. So how do these affect us? I'm sure that we're all aware about how these biases affect us and types of unconscious biases that can infiltrate our perceptions and attitudes towards other people. And it can be something, you know, we have gender bias, cultural, age, they all come out in different ways. And there's one that I like talking about is the idea of microaffirmations. And this is the one that I always sit and think about, is how much or how little we comfort certain people in different situations. And, you know, why are we more likely to go towards different people to comfort them, and how our biases play out in that.
Okay, so we're going to explore privilege, but we're going to do it in a different route. We need 3 lovely volunteers to help us do a little activity. Yes, yes. Oh, that was quick. Usually I have to bribe because we do have little giveaways for this. Alex is going to set you up.
Hi, how you doing? Good, how are you? All right, who's our next step? Come on up.
We need 3.
Leslie's on her
Kelly? All right, Kelly's gonna be here. Okay, do nothing, just stand there. Yep. And what's Roan? Roan? Great, Roan, you're gonna join me here. Okay, that's fine. And what's your name? Leslie, you're gonna come with me.
All right, so the only rule is you cannot move your feet and where you've been situated, and you have to get whatever you have in your hand in that bucket. That's it.
That's the privilege. I would never really do it. Yeah, look, man, are you doing the same thing as me? Can I go?
Yeah, just heads up.
Oh. Don't hit me. I missed. All right.
So I don't know if you saw, but this second person got 2 or 3 pieces of paper. The last person only got 1 piece of paper. And a speaker in the way.
Can somebody help them? Can I help you? I was going to ask that, if I could ask her. Call a friend. Yes, but whatever.
I only said the only rule was you can't move your feet, and the object needs to get in the basket.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Okay, so I have some questions for the 3 of you. Who got the better results and why?
The best.
Initially, who got the best results? Yes. What were the feelings about the rules of the game and how it was set up initially? How did you feel being way over there?
A little bit confused, not also a little confused.
So to the person who was closer to the basket and had no obstructions, you had a ball.
I did.
How did you feel?
This is easy.
This is easy. How did you feel about winning?
I didn't win.
You got it in right away.
Yeah.
Without assistance. Yeah. So every time we do this, something different happens. Sometimes nobody helps and they just do boop, boop, boop. We've had the person in the front totally miss the basket. We've also had, others come up. The very first time I did this, a woman came up in the very back of the room, grabbed them all, put them in, sat down. I was like, oh crap, that wasn't supposed to happen. But that shows, going against the grain, really like testing and questioning rules and, the way things are set up, systems, how they're set up, how to be supportive, how to be that ally. This, I think, really illustrates what that can look like and how that can be, right? But thank you so much for being brave and coming up. Alex has some gifts for you. So this is medicine. I'll just share, they're getting some traditional medicines. These are to protect you. Most people carry them around, keep them in their car. They're sacred medicines. There's also some Mi'kmaq information on there, but thank you for being brave and coming up. So, historical circumstances, social traditions, group dynamics have given certain groups in our society more privilege and power compared to others. Sometimes we don't even know that we're reaping the benefits of historical circumstance or privilege. We just accept that we are closer to the basket than others and carry on. We don't always question or challenge the rules or circumstances that privilege has made some over others. So I really love to reinforce that some groups are closer to the basket because of their identity alone and not necessarily because they have worked harder than others or are more deserving. So I really challenge you to think about this activity in certain situations and think about how you can offer support.
So a great way to view this is really how this, I love this, this visual representation about what an ally is and what it is when you are moving the opposite of that too. So we already talked about allyship again. I'm thanking Chris again. But again, an ally is also, think about who needs allies. What are the situations in which they need support? Really, it's a moving target, and it depends on who you are being an ally. So it was talking before about the LGBTQIA+, I think I got it all. In this one, we're talking about for Indigenous folks, what you do for different groups is going to be different, right? And so, and you're going to be doing it in different set of circumstances. The opposite of an ally is an agent, and I say, because I've mentioned Indian agents, they were the physical enforcers of the status quo and of the law. And so that is the opposite of being an ally. And sometimes you're passive, you're in the middle because you don't have the knowledge, you don't have the wherewithal, you don't have the confidence to speak up, to, as we're saying, deflect or redirect. But the more you learn, the more you can move towards being an ally. And again, it's a moving target. It's not something that you claim for yourself. It's something that you show up for. It's a continuous and consistent action that you're doing for others in other communities. And again, you're not taking up the space yourself, but you're doing things that will support them. So by being here and learning about Indigenous peoples, the policies that were put in place, the history, and it helps you understand more why things happened and how they're continuing to happen today. So we hope that this will help you move towards more reconciliation and towards more allyship in the future. So allyship. So what that is, again, it's a lifelong process of building relationships, and those relationships being built on trust and consistency. And an ally really is if you're willing to reflect, to learn, and to question. And so questioning that status quo, questioning why certain policies or certain things were in place. And this can really inform your actions, and also by sharing knowledge with other people. That makes you an active part towards allyship as well. And so this allyship, it's supporting an individual or groups based on their needs and doing that in a consistent manner. So allyship is also, and I think of this even for myself, it's a way for you to grow personally and to learn about yourself, and while also helping build confidence in individuals and in groups.
All right, I'm going to go through these. I found these amazing tips on top 10 tips on how to be an ally, and I'm going to go through those. I think they're really important to just kind of let it sink in and see where you can imply these. So the term ally means that you may recognize a privilege that you have or may take for granted. That may be the case in your situation. It also implies that you challenge and work towards breaking down barriers that continue to affect Indigenous communities, BIPOC communities, all different types of communities. Ally is not a self-proclaimed title. It is a way of being in the world. While Indigenous people may identify you as an ally, the goal is not to be labeled an ally, but rather to develop authentic and meaningful relationships. So 1, listen to and follow the community. Find out who the traditional caretakers, who the elders are of the land you're on, and when doing long-term work on Indigenous rights, build strong relationships within the community and make sure everything is Indigenous-led. Number 2, center the stories around community. So a big part of your involvement is to amplify the voices of Indigenous communities. That was not the case not too long ago. Don't make it about yourself. You should directly share these messages with your network in their words without alteration. 3, know the historical and cultural context. Knowing the history and being culturally competent is vital. The issues the community face come from hundreds of years of ongoing trauma and discrimination. It is not the responsibility of the community to educate you, but I'll try my best to share as much as I can with you. Number 4, never show up empty-handed. Showing up in support is great, but offer to lend a hand as well. Use your labor, resources, the superpowers you have to help out. Think about what additional value you could bring to a community. Always seek consent and permission. Consent is a continuous process, not a one-time request. So seek permission before taking part in community events, particularly around culture and spiritual events. These will usually be labeled something like all communities and allies welcome. The Mi'kmaq Native Friendship Center usually has events for everyone to come, for all public to come and attend and learn. Number 6, be responsible for yourself. Be aware of what resources you're taking away from communities through your presence. Ensure you're giving back to the community more than you're taking away. Number 7, know when to step back. Be aware of what space you're taking up. Always remember that you are there as a guest in a supportive role. There will be times when the community needs to act alone and to respect their boundaries. Number 8, saviors are not needed, solidarity is. Solidarity is only meaningful if it is substantive and not merely performative. This means showing up to support the community with your presence alone should be the baseline and not the end game. Number 9, be mindful of others' time and energy. Indigenous people often have to be advocates on a wide range of issues that affect them and their community firsthand. They don't have the choice to switch off from being involved and can be spread thin in many directions. Especially a lot of elders or community leaders who do speaking engagements. You could imagine how many times they're being asked to do certain things, which is probably why if you've tried and not heard a response, this is probably why. So just kind of keep that in mind. I find the best way to get a response is to go to community events and get to know the people on a different level and have those meaningful partnerships and relationships, and then things will be a bit different going forward. And number 10, do no harm to the community. The community should be better off or the same because of your presence and not worse. So I'd like to show this little ally continuum illustration. I really think it illustrates where you could be within one of these boxes. So you may have come in here apathetic, not knowing any Indigenous content or awareness at all. It's our hope that today you're leaving aware. You have a baseline understanding. You're going away knowing basic concepts, maybe not active on behalf of self or others. It is my hope that you, after this, are driven to continue your learning, continue learning where you can be, whether it's in your organization or on a personal level, and become active or an advocate. So active, being well-informed, sharing and seeking diversity when asked or prompt, be that person that came and offered support there and putting the objects in the basket. Or an advocate, it's just committed routinely and proactively championing inclusion. So you are within one of these boxes. Just take a moment and figure out where you are. Okay.
So I think this is a great time to say, like, what can you do? You know, first off, you're here, you're learning. This is a great start. Continue that learning, right? It doesn't stop just with one workshop, with one thing. So you could hire Serene again and have this for more staff. You can do the blanket exercise, which is more intimate and also extremely impactful. Like she mentioned, there's the Mi'kmaq Native Friendship Center. That has welcoming all communities events that are really wonderful. There's other types of workshops. There's ways of, attend local drumming, dancing, a Maui that are so joyful and so fun, which are community, run events that typically happen in the summer. and visit Mi'kmaq sites, learn more about history. I also think it's great to watch movies, take in podcasts, take in media that is by Indigenous people, and learn more about where the culture is at today. Learn about art or whatever you're interested in, if it's sports as well. You can also create space. So I'm gonna also, this is a great time to recognize what NSGEU did for the North American Indigenous Games and how you all made space during NAG in a really incredible way. So I was on the receiving end from a wonderful call. I think it was from Julie to the NSGEU headquarters, and they offered us the use of that space for our volunteer center and said, what can we do for you? So that was an active, amazing action that they did for us. And we chose them to be our volunteer center due to the space, and there were so many things that were not expected. We asked, every time we asked to do anything that was put in place, we're like, can we put up some more Indigenous art? Of course. Can we put up this signage that has Mi'kmaq language? Of course. And there was the opening of the space beyond the hours that were typical to the building, the above and beyond welcoming, allowing smudging. And then we were in our working in our office space one day, and we saw painters outside. And I don't know if anyone else saw how the building was transformed during NAG. There was the NAG symbols, it was all of our logo colors, and Jalasi on the other side. It made it such a joyful, beautiful space, and it made it easier to find for our volunteers, and people were talking about how beautiful and wonderful this space was. Not just our staff, but all our volunteers. There's also sharing of resources, there's that beautiful room with coffee and tea and snacks, and we all indulged in that a lot. So there was, say thank you to all of you. So yeah.
All right, so that's just a tip of an iceberg on what can be. Selfless plug, I do offer additional workshops to dig a little deeper on what can be done, whether it's organizational or on a personal level. I bring in my art, I bring in nature, I bring in my culture, we have fun with it. So that's just an additional avenue, as well as that resource list that I sent along. There is a ton in there to continue learning and carrying on. The 5 general Mi'kmaq phrases is something that's in there too. I'm not sure if Elizabeth can send you the actual PDF because you can click on it and hear the words, but there's also additional links where you could download an app on your phone and hear basic terminology and basic words. It's just really great, and there's tons of different areas to just learn those basics and have a little understanding. But this comes to the end of our presentation, and although I wish I could talk longer, we definitely could talk longer, but I know you had a long day today, and thank you so much. It's now, I pass it over to you. It's now your turn to take action and figure out what you can do next. How you can be that ally, in our different areas, and what that looks like for you. And I really challenge you to think about those next 7 generations. Those 7 generations of your grandbabies. What can we do to make sure we're leaving them in a good spot, right? Again, there's so much resources. I just had fun with this. Any question that came up, I've popped into those resources. So I will be opening this up to questions. I just want to caveat this with, I am only one Indigenous person up here who is Mohawk and not Mi'kmaq. I speak on behalf of my lived experience and my family's lived experiences, so I don't have the answer to everything, but I will find out if I don't know a question that you might ask. And I just really want to thank you all for being in this presentation. I can see you all nodding your heads and being part of this, and that's, again, the first step to moving forward together. So thank you on behalf of me and Alex for bringing us in here. Really appreciate it. Thank you.